Joan by Carol M Mottershead. Chapter 2. I was still crying when Alison arrived, interrupting my thoughts. "Whatever is wrong, my dear?" she asked with such concern. "Sorry, I forgot you can't speak," she added. I shook my head and brushed away the tears with my bedsheet as I sat up to greet her, putting a smile on my face. Unable to speak, Alison decided to buzz for a nurse to ask for an update on my condition. No one arrived. Alison, not one for sitting around, went out to find someone and returned a short while later. "So what are you doing about it? Why hasn't the doctor been to see her today? When I arrived she was in tears, poor thing. You've left her here alone in this side room with only her silence for company. Well, I want to speak to someone immediately. Someone who can give me answers. I want answers, I tell you." "The doctor will see Joan tomorrow," said the nurse patiently. "Dr. Venables is off today. She did explain this to Joan," she said, directing the latter response to Alison. "For now, Joan needs to rest. After tea she will be due her tablets to help her to sleep some more. You've been asleep this afternoon, haven't you, Joan?" she queried. I nodded. "The tea trolley will be round once visiting time is over. Then we'll settle you down for the night. Is that okay, Joan?" I nodded again. I didn't want to cause any trouble. I needed help, and I needed Alison to shut up. Alison was going to continue questioning the nurse, but I grabbed her arm and shook my head. If I was going to be dependent on the staff, I didn't want to ruffle any feathers by upsetting anyone. Alison took the hint, reluctantly. Sitting down on one of the chairs, she took out a bag of grapes from her handbag and placed them on the bed. At first she complained about the staff in the hospital, then began chattering away about not much at all, while snibbling on the fruit as she did so. Soon, thank goodness, it was time for visitors to leave, and I was able to recover from the assault on my ears from her incessant chattering. While I lay resting, I let my mind wander again to those earlier days. I remember many weeks had passed since Mother's funeral, and I hadn't seen Father in all that time. His absence was nothing new for me, for he spent a lot of time away from home when Mother was alive. He had never really been part of my life. Mother and I, on the other hand, were inseparable. I was her world and she mine. I knew he hadn't gone away as usual, though, for I could hear him talking quietly in his room to someone, or sobbing. If I asked of his well-being, I was simply told Father is very busy, and encouraged to study or entertain myself alone whilst governess consoled him the best way she could. My tears eventually ran dry. I was empty. I could shed no more. One time governess had told me that Mother would be watching over me from high above in the sky, so I would sit and watch the various shapes and shades of white fluffy clouds drifting across the bright blue skies, and imagine she was playing hide-and-go-seek, our favourite game. Sometimes I thought I could see her face in the clouds, and imagined she was smiling down on me. Occasionally clouds would resemble waves on the seashore, and I'd be reminded of the many happy times we spent together on the beach with Grandmama. Once in a while Grandmama would invite servants to join us and bring along their children, so that I would have company. We would spend our days building sand castles, or paddling in the sea, or gathering seashells. I enjoyed playing with the other children, and the seaside became my favourite place to be, the place I felt happiest. I vowed one day that was where I would live. My loneliness seemed to go on for weeks that turned into months. Then one day I was summoned to the library to see Father. It seemed he needed me to carry out some of the duties that Mother used to undertake, escorting him to the public appearances and so forth. I was to learn to be a lady, and I was to have a new wardrobe of clothes that befit my status. Governess was instructed to take me into the city and purchase whatever was needed to turn me from a child into the lady of the house. It was all quite scary, but exciting at the same time. I learned how to walk, talk and act like a lady. I lost count how many times governess made me walk up and down the room with books on my head. It still makes me smile to remember. There was to be no skipping or acting childlike either. I was shown how to conduct myself in polite society, and I was to be introduced to the world beyond our home. Until now, the furthest I'd ever been was to visit Grandmama on the coast, which I loved. But now I was to visit the city, where we would see drawings of the latest fashions. I would be measured for new dresses, shoes, and undergarments. All this fussing about my appearance. It was like dressing my dolls, only I was the doll. My hairstyle changed too. Instead of wearing my hair down with my usual ringlets freely blowing in the wind, I was to wear my hair up. It could be plaited and rolled at the sides of my head for informal occasions. And for more formal occasions I could have ribbons braided into my hair to add colour, rolled up at the back of my head with only one single ringlet by each ear to shape my face. Attitudes of the servants changed too, for they had to be more respectful to me. A bow here, a curtsy there. I do admit to feeling quite delighted over that aspect. There was no laughing at me now. I enjoyed my time with governess. We would sometimes stop off for a cool drink at the local water fountain, or we'd treat ourselves to a new type of dessert made from an ice sugar and flavourings known as granita midway during our day out. It was a forerunner of what we now call ice cream, or Italian ices. Many of the stallholders in our local market already knew governess very well, and would call her, looking for an introduction to me. I met so many people in that first day that my head spun by the end of it. There were stalls of colourful textiles and lots of food stalls filled with delicious smelling fresh-made foods. It was all very new to me. I was so excited when we returned home that night I couldn't sleep. A whole new world was opening up, a world I'd never seen or even dreamed of. There was a lot to learn, and I intended to learn it to make Father proud of me and grow into a beautiful young woman and a lady he could be proud of. I had to become Dame Joan, lady of the house. Our trips into Rome became a regular occurrence in our lives, always something new to see or people to meet. It was during one such journey we came across a troupe of entertainers known as Commedia dell'arte. They wore strange-looking masks with faces of all shapes and sizes, some grotesque, some smiling. Their costumes were many and colourful, and as varied as the entertainers themselves. There were drummers drumming, flautists flaunting, and guitars plucking their tuneful songs, and many other curious instruments. Other performers used circus skills, clowning, juggling, or eating fire. Some even stood on long sticks hidden under their clothing to make them appear taller. It was all extremely entertaining. We began watching their plays every time they were in the city, and they were never boring, for each one was different. You could always tell when they were about to start, for they would deliberately play their music loud to attract the crowds. Then they'd send in the clowns with their tumbling and tomfoolery, and finally the word-mongering actors would begin their play. The plays themselves, full of humour and lewd comedy, made fun of lovers of romance. Local political figures were another popular target for their comedy, including nobles and the like. I once wondered if father would be mentioned one day. That would have been funny. Personally, I thought them very amusing, but I wasn't so sure about governess. She would often turn her head away, shaking her disapproval, making tutting sounds as she did so. But on occasion she could be heard snickering into her kerchief. Governess would feign her reluctance, but I loved to see them. Their music and laughter looked like so much fun. I remember thinking at the time how wonderful their life must be, and how much I would love to be part of it. We'd been visiting the city for a couple of years before I saw him close up for the first time. He was one of the actors with an odd-looking mask. He wore all white, loose-fitting clothes with an exaggerated hump on his back and an oversized paunch of a belly. The mask with its beak-like nose only partially covered his face. He already invited several members of the audience to take part in their performance when he stopped, right in front of me. His outstretched arm, his hand reaching out for mine, silently invited me to take part in the show. My heart missed a beat as he looked directly into my eyes. The man in charge of the show shouted they had enough volunteers. The actor continued to hold my gaze. I blushed. He raised his mask momentarily, giving me a cheeky grin and a wink before replacing his mask and racing back to rejoin the other players. My heart beat faster. My breathing quickened. The way he looked at me. I didn't realise it at the time, but I was falling in love. I wanted to meet him after the show, but governess pulled me away, muttering something about the audacity of young men today. But for me, I felt only excitement. It was a new experience. Someone had actually chosen me. And such a charming and gallant young man. I had to see him again. Anticipation welled up inside me. There was a spring in my step. I reluctantly walked away. Next time. I'll wait until next time they're in Rome. How long will that be? 3 months? 4? At such a young age, 3 months was like 3 years. I couldn't wait. But I'd have to. The days dragged. Weeks. Months. It's what seemed like years. Father and governess kept me busy learning all about my duties as well as my schoolwork. Even that didn't help. The time passed quickly enough. More than 3 months had passed when we finally saw a notice announcing that Commedia dell'arte would be back in Rome the following week. I couldn't contain my excitement at the prospect of seeing him again. Governess, knowing how I felt, didn't want to take me with her, and tried always to put me off. She lingered over breakfast that morning, hoping to arrive late for the show, but realising I was not to be deterred, she finally prepared to leave. This time the show was the best we'd ever seen. It seemed more enjoyable now that I felt I knew someone in it. I made sure that where we stood watching the show was near to where they entered and exited the performance area. As the performance finished, I could see him looking round the rim of the audience. I dared to hope that he was looking for me. Surreptitiously, I had walked to where he was exiting. He was waving to the applause of the crowd, then turned to leave their sights. Ah, I remembered it as if it was yesterday. He stopped suddenly, having almost knocked me over, after I had deliberately stood in his path. I was smiling broadly with excitement. I couldn't see her face, but I knew Governess would be scowling. Removing his mask to apologise, he was even more handsome than I remembered. He recognised me instantly and returned my smile with that cheeky grin of his. My breath caught in my chest. My pulse raced and my face reddened with my brazenness. His gaze held mine as he apologised. Seeing Governess close by, he briefly acknowledged her presence and introduced himself to me directly, his eyes never leaving mine as he pronounced his name with an exaggerated pursing of his lips. Pulcinella. Governess abruptly interrupted the inappropriate introduction, reluctantly proffering my name in reply. I smiled once again as he took both my hands in his and kissed them, one at a time, resting his lips a little longer than one would deem appropriate in polite society. My heart skipped a beat, his twinkling eyes gazing into mine. He made me feel special. I'd never been introduced to anyone without Father being present before. It felt so inappropriate. I tingled with excitement looking at Governess. I pulled away, but not too quickly. I smiled shyly once again. This time I knew it to be true. I was in love. Governess grabbed my hand and pulled me away. I dreamily allowed myself to be led, wanting to hold the image of his smile in my memory before walking alongside Governess, with a skip in my step and a smile on my face that lasted all day long. I tried talking with her later that night, but Governess was having none of it, telling me he was a no-good waster and I should forget him. But I couldn't. I fell asleep that night, hoping to dream about him, hoping to remember his smiling face for as long as possible. Pulcinella.